A few years ago, back before PhilosophyTube went insane, he made a video where he claimed that the right was weak because it refused to look after the poor and vulnerable. He argued leftists are so dominant now because they create a community of vulnerability, and this makes them immensely popular, while the right continues to marginalize itself by caring only for elite interests. I was going to make a video about this way back then, but never got around to it, so I think maybe it's time to readdress that subject. PhilosophyTube is lying about what the left actually is. He relies on a fictional dialectic where the left is soft, weak, and philanthropic, while the right is authoritarian, repressive, and cruel. But the reality is that the left is very conformist and authoritarian itself. The left will propose welfare policies and promote stuff like mutual aid, but they're very careful to ensure that they disqualify anyone who doesn't agree with them. If you disagree with gender ideology, they won't help you. If you disagree with feminism, they won't help you. If you disagree with gay rights, they won't help you. Even if you are a leftist, but you piss off the wrong people or have an unconventional view of leftist politics, like let's say you're a Maoist, but everyone else is a dim soc, they will result to brutal group warfare tactics to ostracize you. This happens all the time within leftism. For example, there is internecine warfare in the trans community versus people who are true scum, or people who think that only some people are truly trans, and people who think that any trans identity is valid. They are very busy trying to push down dissent wherever it pops up, and they try to ruin the life and reputation of anyone who disagrees with them. The left isn't so much about helping vulnerable people as it is about enforcing a given status quo. Even if you're vulnerable, if you disagree with their established view, it's as if you didn't exist for them. Leftists are universalists who like to imagine a fictional, universal brotherhood of humanity, and they see stuff like kinship dynamics, the family, race, and ethnicity as barriers to the expression of this universal human morality. That's why Marx wanted to abolish the family and religion. They are very inconsistent on this because all the time leftists are bickering about how far this universal brotherhood extends. They are not consistent in their universalism. The universal brotherhood of humanity, for some reason, ends at white people. Even underprivileged, poor white persons are presumed to benefit from white privilege and are subject to anti-white discrimination, such as disadvantages in enrollment in universities or rejection of access to scholarships and aid money. White culture is said to not exist. Whites are erased demographically and culturally, so this idea of the universal morality of humanity essentially just skips over white people in the leftist mind. If you're white, you're not allowed to be vulnerable. Every Machiavellian, bloodthirsty, and power-hungry leftist policy specifically targeted at you is validated. Leftists don't care about the vulnerable, they care about the continual political dominance of leftism as well as non-white supremacy. Leftists like to call themselves self-congratulatory names. They're quote-unquote liberals or quote-unquote socialists. What's bad about being liberal or being social? There's a huge disconnect between the way leftists see themselves and the way leftists have actually behaved throughout history. Leftists see themselves as the champions of the downtrodden, meek revolutionaries carrying olive branches for the underprivileged. They see themselves as the good guys. But the reality is that every time leftism has had a grand opportunity for implementation in the past, it has resulted in the worst human violence and oppression imaginable. 100 million people died under communism. Stalin killed millions, Mao killed millions, Pol Pot killed 2 million Cambodians. Was this a community of vulnerability? By that you mean a community that exploits the vulnerable just as a predator exploits his prey? I suppose so. The self-congratulatory view leftists have of themselves as vegetarian philanthropists cannot be further from the truth. They say they are socialists, but they are antisocial. They break down every institution that guarantees societal stability. They break down the family, a social unit. They break down religion, a social community. They break down gender, which guarantees the stability of social and sexual dynamics, and they break down race, which guarantees kinship sociability. They will do anything to make their fiction, universal humanity, a reality by violently eradicating differences. They say they celebrate diversity while impugning people who are actually saying there are significant human differences. Leftists just don't care about you. They say they do, and all their propaganda is based around the lie that they're out for the common good. In reality, leftists are only out for leftists. Are you vulnerable? You'd better check if you agree with the party first, otherwise your vulnerable status won't matter. And leftist belief is always changing since it's a dialectical ideology, So you'd better make sure you've updated your views to the latest permutation of leftism. Otherwise, you might get called a reactionary, a racist, a transphobe, all words that translate in the leftist mind to bad guy. What this appeal to popular well-being actually is an appeal to minority well-being. They don't care about you if you're the majority. The only reason they do this is because they are cognizant that this is an ethnic group conflict and they're backing the opposition. Leftists are anti-white and they want to destroy white societies. So what better way to do this than funding programs that benefit minorities at the expense of whites? What better way to do this than to fuel racial conflict and prevent anyone from putting a stop to it? If the left really cared about the vulnerable, then why is white nationalism so attractive to poor, underprivileged, working class white people? Why do working class ruralites mainly vote Republican? They have to accuse them of false consciousness, because what shows that they care about the underprivileged and the vulnerable more than taking away their mental agency? The reality is that these groups know the history of leftism. They know the brutal repression and violence that leftists have always wrought wherever they have taken power. They know that it's group conflict, leftist minorities against a white majority. And they know that if they surrender in that conflict, they will be the ones lined up against a wall. The only people who genuinely care about the poor, downtrodden white man are white nationalists. That's why, despite absolute leftist domination of politics and culture, white nationalism is more popular than it has ever been, at least in the timeline since the US stopped being white nationalist after World War II. They know that the left won't feed them. They see through the self-congratulatory leftist identity and see these predators for what they are. Leftists aren't kneeling down to help poor whites. They're not trying to have a dialogue with whites who feel slighted by affirmative action or non-white supremacy. They aren't trying to solve the issues of racial violence. In fact, they're accelerating that violence. The game is so obvious that even the uneducated can understand it. That's why the left cannot win over poor whites. They're tired of being told by political actors that anyone has their best interests in mind but themselves. Leftists will claim that rightists just don't want to help anyone out but themselves. This is actually true of the left, since leftist aid is contingent upon accepting leftist belief in domination. But the reality of this view, that humans ought to indiscriminately help out anyone in the universal brotherhood of man, is incredibly naive and does not describe the harsh reality of human differences, group dynamics, and human evolution. Humans evolved for kinship reciprocity. We help those out who are close to us because we're hardwired that way. And the reason for that is because anyone who wanted to help out other tribes at the expense of one's own, which is like reverse ethnocentrism, just ended up getting eliminated. Ethnocentric tribes had an advantage over non-ethnocentric tribes because the internal cooperation and trust helped them win conflicts. Humanity has thus been relatively ethnocentric for at least as long as we can measure human action. To argue that it is moral one should help out one's enemies is essentially to argue that it is just to lose every war. It is just to be subjugated, just to be dominated. Leftists like to deny the inevitability of human conflict. They envision a globalized world where every ethnicity and race is living in perfect harmony. Either that, or a world in which there are no races and thus no reason for conflict. But the reality is, even if you were to eliminate all human differences, which of course would require a lot of domination, erasure, and violence, we would just invent them. Humans need social closeness, and we all have different needs and wants. Those needs and wants will clash with those of other groups, and there will always be limited resources available, as well as historical grievances to redress. Conflict is inevitable even in a perfect Marxoid world because it's just human nature. This is why the universalist idea of a human brotherhood is naive. The reason why it's dumb to be totally indiscriminate in one's altruism is because that altruism is not always reciprocated, and in fact, it can be used against you, as has happened in places like the UK. If you're helping out someone who hates you, no amount of help will ever be enough. They will keep robbing you, and when you cut them off, they will go to war with you. They are effectively enemy states demanding tribute, and the dynamics are exactly the same. Stop bribing them with gifts, and they'll cut your hand off. Universal altruism is just asking for failure. It would only work in a world where everyone was exactly the same person and had exactly the same environment. We don't live in that world. We have a multiplicity of personalities and environments with variable resources. Everyone has a different interest. Everyone has a different intention. In a world like ours, you have to be careful who you help out so that your trust and goodwill isn't taken advantage of. The only society altruism really works in is in a homogeneous high-trust society where you can be sure your altruism will be either reciprocated or at least not abused. That's why nationalism has such great appeal. It takes the conditions of the world we live in seriously and tries to figure out how to create the most stable and functional pro-social societies under these parameters. It tries to protect groups of people from abuse rather than sending them to the wolves of pathological altruism. Nationalist societies do help out the vulnerable, they just help out their own vulnerable. The reason why leftism is successful today over rightism is simply because leftists have managed to better dominate society than rightists. Leftists have power, they have wealth, they have numbers, they have powerful financiers on their side. Every major corporation today follows leftist ideology. They can spark riots anywhere there is resistance. They can donate to favorable politicians. They can set up university departments and think tanks. They can cancel, deplatform, and silence people while ruining their lives. They have the ability to oppress, and that oppression is the actual reason behind their success. Leftism does not succeed because it's friendlier than rightism. They succeed because they're more ruthless.